All right. Well, welcome to our 21st SLiTHER. We're approaching our 1 year anniversary of these things. And today I think we'll start just very briefly with a DEI moment of something I'm doing here tonight. We're doing our first live in-person movie watch together with students, and we're actually including some other departments, the rock people, the physics people in the basement, and the biologists. Um, it's a little bit of a shame for a event on inclusion that we didn't include the rest of the sciences like psychology and math, but we still got COVID issues, so we want to make sure we don't pack our room too much. But we're getting together and we're going to watch Picture a Scientist and have a discussion about that, which should be good. We've done some other video watches via Zoom, so it's going to be interesting and maybe a little challenging. This isn't my sweet spot of leading a discussion of that in person afterwards, but something exciting and something new we haven't done before. So looking forward to that. But with that, let me turn things over to Matt and Megan, who are going to kind of talk today a little bit about something that we're all thinking about, and that's this stupid pandemic. Have we gotten anything good out of it that we're going to keep doing? So with that, the floor is yours.
All right, Megan, you should have remote control now, just to make sure.
Theoretically, we tried it before, but there we go. Okay, so maybe I had one click. Our goal, since I didn't mean to change that slide, was to kind of figure out whether or not this last year was a complete waste for all of us as we scrambled to put, for a lot of us, all our stuff online, or at least even if we were in person, completely revamped to deal with COVID restrictions. And so I took the take that it wasn't all bad. And I'm not going to there's a lot that I'm not just throwing out from the last year as we go back face to face. So we're going to take a minute and introduce our universities. Matt and I teach at very different universities. So I'm at IU Bloomington, which is the flagship campus. We're an R1 research institution. We have about 34,000 undergrads and 1,000 full-time grad students. Our acceptance rate and graduation rate, roughly the same, 78%, 76%. Our specific department, we have around 28 tenure track faculty that all do research. It's a little iffy, depends if you want to include our biochem in there or not. Sometimes they want to be, sometimes they don't. We actually have 8 full-time lecturers. So we have a fairly large group of lecturers. In addition, we have 3 visiting or adjunct lecturers, and we're really lucky that they love to teach. So they are pretty much as involved as the full-time lecturers. And we offer BA and BS in both chemistry and biochemistry that's housed in our department, and then also PhD. So I teach 3 main courses. Gen Chem 1, that course is around 700 students. So I'm not actually talking about that one this time. And then I teach inorganic lectures and labs and an advanced inorganic lab. The inorganic lecture is around 200 students. The matching lab to that is around 100 students. And then the advanced inorganic, you see a drastic drop because it's no longer required for med schools or pre-health, and to 10. So it's a huge drop there. And I have been a lecturer for IU from 2015. I actually did my PhD at IU and then turned around and was a visiting faculty member for them and then hired full time. So pre-COVID, all in person, I had never done any online teaching. I did lots of active breaks. So, the Think, Pair, Share, group work, some flipped classroom, but never done anything all online. So that was a huge difference for me. Matt will tell you a little bit about his teaching style.
All right, so Colorado State University, Pueblo, where I'm at. I actually, hit the wrong button. I actually had no idea there was a Colorado State University, Pueblo, until I applied there. We're a regional comprehensive, primarily undergraduate institution. We're an HSI, and I think this last year we became an MSI, so approximately 50% minority students. Full-time student population, much smaller than Megan's institution. 3,000 undergrads. We were about 5,500 when I started in 2012. So we've definitely had reduced enrollment. Our acceptance rate is much higher, and our graduation rate is really, really low. So I think the average age of our students is 28 or 29. So we don't get a lot of traditional students. We have students who are holding part-time, full-time jobs, multiple jobs. They will have families for the most part. They might be veterans, things like that. So we have very diverse, not only culturally classrooms, but also with respect to social situations or demographics. Our department is technically supposed to be 8 tenure track faculty. I've got 6 here in quotes because one of our tenure track faculty is the dean of the college. One is the director of the Institute for Cannabis Research. So we're really running on like 4 full-time faculty. We have 2 vacancies. We have a visiting and we have a research professor. And the visiting and the research professor kind of fill in some of these gaps. We offer a BS and an MS, and we have a 3+2 program for the MS. I teach mainly Gen Chem. Every semester I teach Gen Chem. So whether it's Gen Chem 1 or Gen Chem 2, lectures and labs, and usually teach or I always teach inorganic in the fall. Advanced inorganic would be in the spring, but I haven't taught advanced inorganic in a really long time because it's required for the ACS certified degree, and our students don't go for the ACS certified degree. And it's also on a rotating schedule, like every other year. So maybe I might get 4 or less than 4 students there. General chemistry is 20 to 40, inorganics less than 10. So again, very different student population compared to Meghan. And I'm going to actually speak more towards what I've done with general chemistry rather than inorganic chemistry. And Meghan's, I think, going to talk more about her inorganic courses. Teaching experience, I taught like 2 lectures at the University of Minnesota as a postdoc, maybe 3. So that was my experience before coming into a primarily undergraduate institution. And I taught how I'd been taught up until COVID. So it was always sage on the stage. Here's a problem. I'm going to wander around, look at you, hover over the top of you and intimidate you until you start working on it. So COVID really opened my eyes to everything that's out there. So I've always tried to figure out these active learning techniques or these alternative teaching techniques. And I think this was really the catalyst for me to start moving in that direction, for which many of you were probably already familiar with or are already using. So Meghan, I'll let you take it over.
So to give you an idea, okay, I don't think I can control your screen, Matt, even though it seriously tells me I can. So if you will flip the slides, that would be awesome. All right. So all of our stuff went fully online. So I was faced with teaching an inorganic chemistry lecture that was 200 students online, and then a lab. And our labs were a little weird, so I'll explain that in a minute. But most of it, from my point of view, was online. So the inorganic lecture was completely online. The way I ended up doing it was I took the content and did that asynchronously. So it was due, they had a chunk due twice a week. And then we had quick texts that are an IU specific Canvas thing, but essentially low stakes questions they could answer as many times as they wanted before the deadline, just as a, for them, kind of a self-assessment of where they're starting their understanding of the lecture content. But for me, kind of that like, hey, I need you to keep up, right? You're not coming to me. I need you to do this on your own. I saw a lot of students who at the beginning really liked the idea that they could do class whenever it fit in their schedule. And then as that semester went on, that became a lot harder for them to do, as opposed to having to show up to lecture. And then instead of putting 200 students onto Zoom at once, I split them up into 3 groups, and they came to synchronous problem solving sessions twice per week via Zoom. And then all office hours were Zoom. And so I had kind of the way I set those Zoom sessions up was I started the session with random questions. I would usually play music in a face-to-face class, but we were on Zoom and I'm not super tech savvy for that. So instead I would just ask a random question, like, one of the funniest ones that I got responses for was, if you could be on any reality show, no explanation needed, what would your choice be? And people would just say it in the chat out loud. It just started conversation. And I would start that around 5 minutes before class. And the nice part was, as the semester went on, more people showed up to do the random question, which meant more people were already on Zoom and ready to start class. And then at the end of class, to kind of promote this community, a lot of our students, and I'm sure a lot of yours did too, talked about how isolated they felt being in their dorm room all the time. So we did a celebration minute at the end where they could type anything they were happy about in the chat. And that was my challenge to them, was come up with something. So we celebrated good naps. We celebrated being done with quarantine, and we celebrated med school acceptances. Everything was celebrated. And I saw students staying on after class technically ended until people were done with their celebration. So it really started to build community. The entire time was spent in breakout rooms, engaged in activities. We put them in pre-assigned groups. And then we used Google Jamboards for work examples. A lot of the inorganic requires not typing, right? Drawing structures, inserting images, doing things like that. And the Jamboards, if you've never used them, they work a lot like Google Docs. So I could in real time see everything that they were working on in each group. Every group had their own slide. And then I could use that to find common misconceptions, or, hey, this group had a really great method. And when I would bring them back together, I could use the Google Jamboards to show what people were doing. The nice part was they remained available on our Google Drive even after class. So students and their groups could go back, they could continue working on them, things like that. The quizzes, and I used challenges instead of exams, a different thing, but they were given via Canvas, mix of auto-graded and then PDF uploads for anything hand-graded. They were open note, so I gave them with a restricted page limit because we were using web monitoring software, so that was a different issue. But they had 3 pages front and back, which if they had done their studying, then 6 full pages would have been plenty for being open note. And then the quizzes had retake opportunities, and I had never done retakes because usually I have 2 TAs that would be grading 200 students with a quiz every week, all hand graded, and I just don't have the time, or my poor TAs don't have the time to do all that grading. And then the lab was a little bit different because technically they could come onto campus, but we were restricted to 7 students per lab section out of what would normally be a lab section of 20. So we had to divide the class into 3 cohorts, and they only ended up going into lab 3 times in the entire semester. Everything else was done online. And because we had 2 virtual labs and 1 in-person running each week, it was all asynchronous. So that was a little bit of a challenge on our end. And then the assessments were changed from worksheets and lab reports, which had traditionally been used in our department, to communication style assessments. So writing a research brief, making an infographic. They did write a journal article, mostly because my students weren't, only about maybe 20% are even looking to go on to grad school. Most are professional, so they're not going to be writing a lab report. And let's be honest, worksheets, for us at least, just get passed semester to semester. So these were kind of more creative. They prevented passing it down, but it also, my students gave me the feedback that they liked feeling like they were learning a new communication style that they might actually use later. And then we also use a spec grading system to help students define goals. So those were all new. For both courses, we relied heavily on something called Inscribe. It runs through Canvas. Piazza is another example, but they're course-wide messaging systems. And so I can post things, students can post things, they can kind of wiki style edit the post to give answers. And that was amazing because it cut down on email to me. My rule was you had to post on our course-wide messaging system before you were allowed to email me or any of our teaching team directly. And that really cut down on any emails that were, when is something due? Or can you clarify this in the syllabus? And even, homework questions, things like that. So the students would actually be answering each other, and I didn't have to do that. And they were answering at times that I wasn't even near my computer. So that was really great. And then I also sent weekly wrap-ups at 4 each Friday. And these weekly wrap-ups were just kind of, this is the content we did this week. This is where we're going next week. Here are some deadlines coming up that you need to be aware of. But my idea was if they read nothing else throughout the week, they could go to that wrap-up and have all the information they needed. And so that was kind of how I focused communication, since all of our communication was online. And so, well, we will be back face to face, and I can't even describe how excited I am for that. As I was thinking about redesigning this course for face to face, there were a number of things I was going to keep, or I decided to keep. Matt, you want to switch the slide? I still can't control it. So a couple of kind of 6 things that I want to keep. The first is actually keeping Zoom office hours. And what I'm going to do is make them as a hybrid for ones that I offer during what I would call a normal schedule or when I'm on campus. So students can access them from anywhere. I noticed I had students that were, shifting their lunch break at work, and they would sign on to office hours while they were on break, where they wouldn't have been able to come on campus. Or between classes, where they had 20 minutes between classes, they could jump on Zoom, get a question answered, and then go to class. And again, they wouldn't have been able to make it to a building. For me, I have 2 young kids, and so my evenings are really precious with my kids, and they still go to bed at 7. So while I can jump on Zoom at 7:30 or 8 and do an evening office hour that my students tend to really like, I'm not about to drive into campus and do one face to face at that point. So it offers me a little bit more flexibility for matching what students are looking for in their schedule. And then similar to what I did during the synchronous sessions, I'm actually going to continue to use the Google Jamboards during my office hours. For the ones that are hybrid, the Jamboards can be accessed by students who are on Zoom or in the class with me, so everyone can actively be working on the problems. And then again, people can access them afterwards. So if they're curious or they couldn't make it to office hours that day, they can jump on and see what we did. I'm going to keep my quizzes online. I really went back and forth with this, but it allows me to keep the retake opportunities. One of my favorite quotes was from a student, and so it's what I wrote. It's made me feel like you cared about what I knew and not just my score. So the fact that it gave them an incentive to go back and look at what they missed and learn it and really try and understand it. And then they could show us that improved learning on a retake. The way I'm going to do that, though, is like I mentioned, I had never done it before because of always giving quizzes in class. Moving them online opens up about 30 minutes a week for me in class, where I'm not adding content, but I can do a lot more engaging activities. It also allows me to use some auto grading, so it cuts down on the grading for my TAs than what they would usually do, and allows us to do the retake. And so for a course of 200 students, my TAs are super excited about it, and I'm really excited about what we can do in the class with that extra time. And then I'm actually going to keep, this is something I've done for a while, actually, I have to admit, before COVID, is keep the video availability of all my lecture content. I used to just walk into class and hit record and just like post a 50-minute video for students. Now, thanks to COVID, I have nicer videos with smaller top, chunks, nice slides, learning goals written on them. So I'm going to post those for students. For Flip Classroom, I embed quiz questions in them to help make sure those videos they have to watch. The others are just available as resources. Because I teach in this level, I have mostly juniors and seniors. So I have a lot of students who are on grad school interviews, med school interviews, pretty much any interview you can pick. And then obviously students who are involved in athletics. You also have, students who get sick. Even after COVID, it's not quite such a big thing for us. We'll still have students getting sick. And so this doesn't punish them. They can keep up with the content. I'm sure, we remember just get a note from a friend, right? That never quite matched being in class. So this way they have all that. And I will put a note because a lot of people have concerns if they post lectures about students not coming. I've done this since 2017 and I have not seen a drop in my attendance. I think if you make the course engaging enough when they're there, they realize that it's not a substitute. And so I have had students watch it. They use it a lot afterwards. I was just looking at some data for how many students actually go back and watch them at their own pace. They can pause it. They can go, review things, but they're still coming to lecture. So that hasn't been a thing I've seen. And then the virtual experiments, before we always just had to let a student, if they were sick, they couldn't come to lab. And with the number of students we have taking labs, we cannot have makeup labs. We just don't have the time in our schedule or availability in our lab rooms. And so we just had to kind of bite the bullet and say, okay, in some cases they could get data from a friend, but it was still not the same. So with the virtual experiment videos we have now, we can actually use them to complete the assessments, even if they are sick or can't actively be in lab. And then the last things, I'm sure a lot of us probably did this. We made videos introducing ourselves, right? Because they weren't meeting us in class. And I'm actually going to keep these videos, even though my students will meet me day one. And so I won't go as in depth, but just something to kind of say like, hey, this is me, this is what I do, a little bit about what I do outside of work. One of the things I think was a benefit of COVID in both directions. I know my students started to see me as more than just the person in front of the room. They realized I was a mom. I had kids popping up on videos regularly, but I had other things outside of work. And same thing for me. I saw them on their lunch breaks at work, also working on class. And so it helps build some of that community. So I'd like to do that before day one starts. In addition to all my TAs, and I usually have around 20 undergraduate teaching assistants. Unfortunately, they can't grade for us, but they do help as far as during group work. So I have videos of all of that, helping students get to know them. I'm going to keep using the Jamboards for in-class examples. I've already kind of talked about that, so I won't go into that. I am going to keep my random questions and celebration minutes. Students actually seem to really like that and get into it. So I use Mentimeter. It's a free program or not even a program, a free website. And I'm going to have the questions up as students walk in, and so they can answer them as they feel like it, and we can chat about it. And then instead of doing the celebration minute at the end, because our campus is huge and a lot of students actually have a hard time getting from class to class, even when we let them out on time, I'm actually going to take just a 3-minute break during the class, so they can refocus, they can check their phones, check their email, do whatever they want. And at the same time, during that break, they can post their celebrations and we can kind of do that. So work it into the middle of class instead. And then the last thing I'm going to keep is for the lab course, which are those communication style lab assessments. Mostly because of these two quotes, not just these two, but this is the feedback we got from students. They felt like they were doing something they would do in their job. And they realized how hard it can be to communicate science to someone who doesn't know it. And that second one for me, I have a lot of students who want to be doctors, and I have to remind them that most of their patients didn't go to med school, right? So whatever they're saying, they have to be able to communicate it. And so I really like that they thought they were getting something out of it. So as far as my end, I would say last year wasn't a total waste. There's a lot that I'm excited, as much as I'm excited to go face to face, there's a lot that I want to keep and leverage some of the online technology that we had to deal with. And I think Matt saw the same thing as he'll tell you about.
All right, so, why is it not forwarding? There we go, okay. Had to take control of my computer again. So I started with spring 2020, just because that was kind of when we all realized that things were going to change for a little bit. I was teaching a studio type lab. It only had about 12 students, or lecture and lab. And I immediately freaked out, made everything asynchronous, and said, I got to get through this and figure out what I'm going to do later on, because I didn't know what was going to happen. And, and students didn't know what was going to happen. So everything went online. In the fall, I was teaching Gen Chem and inorganic. And so the lectures were synchronous lectures using Zoom. My labs for both, for Gen Chem, I had 2 cohorts that would rotate through on alternate schedules. For inorganic lab, we were asynchronous for the first part of the semester, and then we became synchronous. They were in lab. I only had 5 students, so it was easy enough that we could do that. Breakout activities were a big thing for me as I moved online, and trying to get students to be active in and participating rather than just listening to me or pretending they were there, knowing that I was going to post the videos later on to YouTube that they could then forward through. So breakout activities, I'll talk a little bit about how those developed this spring. I used 2-minute reflections. So, that's a thing a lot of people use. And I was really focused on how am I doing? And again, in the spring, this past spring, that really changed. And then the exams were take home, where I'd post them on the LMS. in our case, Blackboard, and they would download them and then repost them, or they were auto-graded online exams. And so in this in part over our winter break, and then kind of as I moved through spring semester, I really shifted my focus. So like my breakout activities in the fall were about 15 minutes, and I tried to fit one in every other class. And I switched that out in the spring because I was teaching the synchronous and asynchronous general chemistry 2 lectures and all 3 sections of lab. And in this case, the labs started out asynchronous and then moved completely on or back in person at reduced capacity. And that was great. It was nice to be together again and being able to interact with the students. The harder part for me though was the lecture. How do I adjust the lecture in terms of not getting to see my students? Some of them may not have their video on. Some will use the chat, some will pipe up, and I'm trying to, as all of us were probably trying to do, you're trying to watch the chat, you're trying to watch the participants, you're trying to focus on your slides or what's coming up next. So I would record the lectures and then post them for the asynchronous students. So I had, I think, 18 synchronous students and about 15 asynchronous students in the spring. And so those were, again, 2 separate courses. But the breakout activities, they started to change. There'd be 1 to 2 or 3 breakout activities during the week, but they would be anywhere from 5 minutes to almost 40 minutes, depending on how I structured them. So if it was just a quick computation or a quick concept check, that's my 5-minute breakout session where people could discuss it, and then we'd discuss as a class. So almost kind of a think, pair, share in a way. The 40 minutes ones, I would post a series of questions for each different room, and they'd have to work through kind of, I don't want to say scaffolded, but it was kind of scaffolded to get them to think about each step in solving one thing and then using that to solve the next. For the 2-minute reflections, they were every 2 weeks, and they were really focused on the student. Like, how are you studying? How do you feel about the upcoming exam? How do you think you will do, or what could you do to improve your score? Really trying to get the students to think about how they're participating rather than how I'm participating. And I got a lot of feedback about that from students. They felt like I was one of their only professors that really cared what they were learning and how they were adapting or dealing with the semester. And so that's going to be one of the things I keep, and you'll see that on the next slide. I shifted to grade scope towards the end of spring semester. It made grading easier. I'm a huge proponent. One of my colleagues asked if I'm secretly accepting money from them because I tell them how great it is. And then I did take home an online exam. So the first couple exams in Gen Chem were take-home exams. They'd have 48 to 72 hours to do the exam. And the exam would really, if they sat down at once, it would take them maybe 4 or 5 hours to work through. So I give them enough time to kind of start it, stop it, be able to use whatever resources they're using. And then I started to shift back online because I was going to use the unsecured ACS exam, and I wanted them to be familiar with taking an exam through the LMS. So those breakout activities, keeping the breakout activities, and in a way, it's kind of the flipped classroom, not really the flipped classroom approach. I'm still lecturing, but it's like having that day or each day being a problem-solving day. Except maybe I'm only doing it once a week or something like that. If I do we have weird 55-minute class periods. But giving the students that chance to work through and discuss the process of understanding, a trend in general chemistry, or how to solve a series of equations in electrochemistry. How do I start with oxidation numbers or oxidant and reductant and oxidized species, all of that stuff. So really trying to get those students to focus a little bit more on the technique or the process of solving those problems. And then The take-home exams, remarkably, the students would always complain, gosh, they're so hard. But everybody said they liked them better. It was a more flexible format for the students who had families or had to work. They liked not being rushed. So a burden, the anxiety burden was taken off some of the students, and they felt like they learned something, because I would try to craft a question in terms of real life examples or fun literary examples, something like that. I leaned really heavily on Andy Weir's The Martian last semester, because I had reread it and I was like, oh, this is great. We got vapor pressure. We can do all sorts of stuff with these questions. So I got a lot of students say, did you just watch The Martian with Matt Damon? And I was like, no, I read the book. Come on, we read books. So take-home exams, I'm still going to keep those, just because it was a different way to engage students. And the take-home exams, using Gradescope, the students were able to see a bit more transparently how things were graded. And I'll come back to that in a second. 2-minute reflections, definitely keeping those. Really focusing more on student self-assessment, because the students really remarked a lot on, I didn't look at the practice exam. I should have looked more at the practice exam. I didn't have time to study this week. I didn't, it was a lot of, I didn't, or I should have, or I just wasn't ready, and I think having them reflect on that and then asking that follow-up a question of what will you do come the next time, really allowed them to take ownership of their learning. Gradescope was definitely more transparent to the students, and it kept me a bit more consistent, because I had that nice rubric that I could pick how I deducted points, and students could see all the different ways that points were deducted, or how a question was graded, or lab. I used it for labs also. I would really like to do recorded lectures, but as with most of us, finding the time and the ability to do that is pretty difficult. I really want to do that, because students liked being able to go back and review the material, especially if they have families or they have to run off to a job and they might miss something. So those are the big things these first three are really the big ones, the ones that I found worked well for my student population. And so those are the three big ones that I'm gonna take home or take forward. So Megan and I, we wanted to ask everybody who's attending, what are you keeping? Because that's really part of the process here, in sharing with the community. So I don't know if anybody is interested in sharing or has questions for Megan and I. I'll stop sharing. Anybody? No. Amanda? Yeah.
What I do think is interesting is how similar some of my experiences are to what you guys observed as well. So it must mean there's something going on there. Because I found, I think, with Zoom office hours that both the students and I took to that a lot better than I might have expected. And students found it really handy that they could just log on for wherever. And I also, like you said, Megan, didn't feel sort of constrained to have to be in my office to meet with a student. And that was very freeing in a lot of ways for me. So I will always give them the option to meet on campus under certain situations, but I think having that flexibility will be nice. I also ended up, so I went full flipped classroom. Like, this pushed me off the deep end entirely in the 2021 year. And I liked it about as well as I thought I would. And I was actually shocked at how much the students liked it. Because I've always heard like, oh, they're going to get pushback. They feel like they're doing too much of their own learning or outside of class. And like, hands down, it was really well received. But one of the things that I found as part of that is that they had to watch like 2 or 3 short videos with some guided notes. And the last question was often one of these reflective questions. What did you struggle with today? What did you find most interesting? How do you feel about the upcoming exam and things like that? And not everybody answered them, but for those students that did, I actually felt like I got to know them a little better and they felt like there was a little bit more personal connection. And I would try and respond to their questions that they would ask me in the LMS, like when they submitted their assignments. And so students felt like they were really engaging with me on that. And that came out a lot. Oh, she always answered all of our questions. And things, you know, it didn't take that long, but it was sort of nice to do that. So for me, those were sort of two big things that I think worked really well.
So can I ask, Amanda, how long you have wanted to flip your classroom for?
I don't know how I would say that I'd wanted to do, like, it's always been there and you've heard all these things. And I would say it was probably in the last 2 or 3 years when I was getting really bored with listening to myself lecture. I think that's what really kind of pushed it finally, right? I'm like, I'm tired of hearing myself talk about this topic. We could be doing something together in class that would be so much more engaging.
I've always wanted to flip it, and that's one of the things I regret not doing this time around. Part of it was just trying to balance family life. So I applaud you in being able to flip your classroom and use this as, again, a catalyst for instructional change. So
I usually flip 6 weeks, so I'm impressed that you went full flip classroom. My 6 weeks is, but I agree, my students liked it. Like I was so nervous for my evals that first semester, especially considering I haven't been promoted yet. Oh, these are gonna look awful. Students liked it, but I think, I don't know if you did this, I spend a lot of time with students telling them why I'm doing it, right? Like, why am I gonna approach it this way? And I found them, as long as I explain to them, like, hey, I'm doing this because I truly think it's gonna help you learn. And now that I've done it, I have some data on like quizzes before and after I flipped it. They buy in, and I haven't had any pushback on it.
I really think they liked the in-class practice and it made them feel like they were really kind of learning it and getting it, or if they were stuck, they were able to make progress and move forward. And what I don't have down yet is still getting them to do the group work effectively. This is mostly in Gen Chem. Some groups work well, some assignments work well. Other times I give them a bunch of problems and they just like sit there and don't talk to each other. Or they
I would say this is a really mean trick, but I found it effective, is I don't give them everyone their own paper, and then they don't have a choice but to work together, and then everyone gets their own copy afterwards. Like everyone does eventually get their own copy. I posted for them, but at first they really struggled with it, and then they slowly got used to, but that way they couldn't do it. I have a lot of students who just, like you said, they would work their own problems, not talk to each other, or they would work it and then check it with each other, and that was their working together. So I just stopped giving them all copies.
You have a good setup for that, because I have basically one of the few big lecture halls on campus anymore, which sucks. But the first day,
the only stadium seating lecture hall. The way I organize my groups, I actually assign seats, which sounds weird for juniors and seniors, but I've actually gotten really good feedback from students on it, which is awesome. But the way I assign their groups is, if you picture like the stadium seating, instead of 4 people next to each other, I do 2 and 2. And then each like pair gets their own paper, and then they have the others that they can turn around and work with. And that seems, I mean, it's our largest like active learning setup classroom at IU is only for 90 people. So that knocks out almost every one of our chemistry classes. And so that's how I've done it with that seating. And it seems to work fairly well. It works much better than when I had them 4 next to each other.
yeah, I tell my students the first day when they're walking in, like, you cannot sit in the 3rd, 6th, or 9th row. And they're like, why? And I said, you'll find out. Just trust me. That way I can get to the middle of the rows and talk to people. It's a big key in that kind of thing.
I will say, for anyone who teaches large classes, just because I'm very sensitive to that topic, if you're going to do those activities, I know, at least I realize I'm very lucky I have TAs, but I have 2 for 200 students. And so when I divide them into groups of 4, that's more than we can handle. I rely really heavily on undergrads. And that would be something I would definitely say, if people are going to take some of the flipped or the breakout room stuff back to face, is make sure you have the help. Because otherwise those groups, if they get stuck, they don't move forward, right? If they can't actually get help. So we can't pay ours for various reasons. So ours are not paid, and I've never had a lack of students willing to do it. So for anyone who teaches large classes, I highly recommend pulling on undergrads. And for us, at least, if you teach large classes, you probably have a large university. And so if you remind them that if they work for you, rec letters are much easier to write. We have never had like students not willing to do it. And so that would be one thing I would say is to use those undergrads. So we don't pay them and they're still willing to work for us.
I would say just like Amanda, I had to do all of my lectures video. So I did all of my lectures on video, got all of them posted. And I think the students during the normal class year were able to do well with that because they're like the typical population of students. But I'm teaching now this summer and it's completely, I had them in class once a week during the school year, like in person. But now in the summer, everything's synchronous online and it's a different population of students. And I think they're struggling more with having to do the lectures themselves. So I'm trying to decide what to do for the fall, if I go back to the more typical class or if I try to continue with you watch the videos, we come in and work problems in small groups and in the fall semester. And I was all set to do one thing and now the summer's kind of making me question what I should do. So it's a little interesting to think about that and kind of where the students are best served. I don't know. It's a difficult decision to make. But I did like the Zoom office hours. I always did one on the night before the lab was due. So the students actually would come and ask questions about how to do the lab when they were actually working on it, as opposed to, having the full week to work on it. They actually came like the night before. I had the same like group of students who always came on that night. So having that flexibility to do the Zoom office hour the night before the lab was due was kind of clutch. I don't know.
It depresses me to hear everybody had great Zoom office hours because I had nobody at my Zoom office hours. And again, that might be
wasn't always. There's just that Monday night before the lab was due on Tuesday that was well populated.
Yeah, I had no one in my Zoom.
I would say I cheat. I have 200 students, so even if 20 show up, my office hours look packed, and it's still only 10% of my class.
One thing I'm kind of worried about, I have like a pretty good set of Gen Chem 2 lecture videos, but now I don't want to change anything ever, like with the content. So I'm like, I guess I'll just do this for a while. But I think I've been making like some videos for pre-lab lectures for labs. And I think it helps the kids kind of know what to expect when they come in a little bit more because we had half the kids coming and half the kids online. And it was just a lot to juggle. So the less I had to say at the beginning and we've also shortened some of our lab times. So I think like just being used to making videos has been helpful to like try to, they're used to watching them, we're used to making them, and that kind of gets a little bit of that out of the way.
Okay, for Matt and Amanda, I don't know if you all found this, how open students are willing to be when you ask them the reflective questions. I really like Matt's idea of doing it regularly and I plan on stealing it. I just asked one at the beginning that was just like, is there anything you want me to know? Because I was thinking like technology issues or access issues, and students like answered just insane things. They had never met me, right? But how much they were willing to open up. And I did answer each of those. And I just said, if you don't want to answer, give me your favorite chemistry meme or joke. And then I posted those on Canvas. But it is impressive how open they're willing to be. And I think that speaks to Matt's point that they just want they want to feel like we actually care about them and not just see them as a like student in the class.
Yeah, I definitely had a lot of TMI. That's probably social media. They're used to posting whatever. But it definitely let me know, what was going on with these students. And I'm usually good with, I'm having a tough time right now. Can I have an extension or do you understand, I won't be able to do this. That's fine for me. I don't need to know every detail, but yeah, definitely. They were sharing everything under the sun. Some of them were extremely blunt, sometimes mean, but they're venting. They're trying to figure out. I think a lot of my students are still trying to figure out their roles in higher education. Like, what does it mean to be a student in higher education? So it was eye-opening. I would look at it and go, I'd never share that with my professors.
Sometimes I wonder, because mine were all written, right? They're usually writing either on the Word document or in the survey. Like there isn't that like I'm having to talk to you about this. I can just like write it and then send it out in the world. So that somehow gives them, I think, a little more comfort too in those cases. But I will say I have to be careful with Zoom office hours, because my other trick is that I don't have set office hours. I just have one of those scheduling where students can schedule appointments with me over like different points all throughout the week. And they love that, because then they could be available when I was available. And so I had a pretty, not everybody came, but a pretty solid, group of students that would come regularly, which was good.
Yeah, I would say, I just launched my reflections through the Google Forms or whatever it is. And the stuff students would type, it was like they could just, get it off their chest or say whatever they wanted. And then it was off. And I would always follow up, especially with I got some concerning ones. So I'd always be following up on those ones. Or just the students that didn't know how, like I said, how to navigate things or what their role was, trying to encourage them to, to try to find their groove. Kind of like, how do you need to study? Or a lot of students were trying to put in 10 minutes here or 30 minutes there, and that works for some people, but it's not going to work for everybody. So
I had one more quick question, I think mostly for Megan, with your quizzes and the quiz retakes, because this is something that I had implemented. I have smaller groups in Gen Chem, but I had started this where they took the quiz and then I graded it and then I gave them back, and 2 days later, then they could do a retake on like a second version of the quiz. And I'd done some homework redos and inorganic, but I'm just curious sort of how you structured your inorganic quiz retakes. Was it the same quiz, different questions? Like, how did you approach all of that?
Yeah, so since we were online, and I don't recommend this first part unless you have a lot of time. Thankfully, I don't have to redo it again. So for the most part, every quiz question had 10 to 15 versions. Obviously, especially with like organometallics and you get into mechanisms, can't have that many and actually have them equal difficulty, but on an average 10 to 15 versions. So we weren't using any video proctoring. And so there at least was a slim chance that they would know someone with the same version. And I lucked out. I didn't have a lot of problems with misconduct. And so they would take the first quiz, we would grade it, but we would give what I would call very broad feedback. So we wouldn't say like, this is where you messed up, but consider units or consider this. And what I would do is in that class messaging system, I would say, question 1, here are common errors that we saw. Question 2, and go through like that and send that out. And then they would be able to retake it. And it was just a random poll. So they may get one of the same questions, but it was just a random poll from all the different versions that were available. In the fall, I gave them the highest of the 2 scores. And what ended up happening there, as the fall continued, fewer and fewer students took the first one, and then they would all like cram for the second one, which in their mind, it gave them more time to prepare. But what they didn't realize was like, 1, you only had 1 chance, right? You then didn't get a second chance. And 2, they were now almost a week and a half behind in material because they were still cramming for the quiz when we were a week and a half ahead. And eventually you run up to the end of the semester and you can't be a week and a half behind or to an exam. So it didn't work out well. In the spring, I changed it such that if they did the retake, so if they just took the first one, they got that score. If for some reason they didn't take the first one, for an excused reason, and they only took the retake, they would get that score. But if they took both, if they did better on the retake, they would get an average. So essentially they could earn back half of their points. If for any reason they did worse, occasionally like a student would do a 0.5 worse or something like that. It was never drastic. I would just give them the first score. I didn't want them to be scared of taking the retake. And then I saw a lot more people putting effort into the first one. I only had a couple students who consistently weren't taking that first one, and I was able to reach out directly to them. But having those question banks, and now because it's online, I have those. I try to add 1 or 2 questions, but the first time I did that, it was awful. I was writing like almost 200 questions a week, and I don't recommend it. And then they're a mix of hand graded, and I usually have about 3 that are hand graded. So between myself and the TAs, we can get through those pretty quickly. And even with a retake, that's 6. total that they might do per week if everyone took the retake versus when we do it by hand. I mean, you're talking 10 questions per week. So it actually ended up reducing our grading with it.
So the retakes then were usually about a week after the originals?
They took the first quiz. I gotta think about this. They took the first quiz on Friday, and I'm gonna change the timing in the fall because I realized that made us grade all weekend, every weekend. But they took the first quiz on Friday. We would have the grades and feedback back by Sunday night or Sunday afternoon. And then they would take the retake. I had an 8-hour window on Wednesday, and once they started it, it would give them an hour. One of the things I would like to do, I had the idea for fall, was to use video monitoring. We had responders for this past year, so that I could leave the retake open for like 5 days and just say, whenever you feel like you're ready to take it, go ahead and take it. We have the web-based monitoring, so there's at least some accountability there. Figuring that could fit better in people's schedules, or if they had an exam that day or something else, they wouldn't have to take the retake. We literally just got an email saying, hey, surprise, we're dropping Respondus web monitoring. So I'm not really sure if that's going to work out in the fall, but I like the idea of them being able to choose kind of when to do that retake that works best for them. I'm just not sure how I would pull it off.
Did you get any feeling from the students on like they had to prep for the retake and then they wound up getting behind and kind of a perpetual spiral?
Yeah. Every once in a while I had students complain that they were taking 2 quizzes per week, and so in the spring, I would say I was a little bit more blunt with students at the start of the semester, and that I was like, look, the retake isn't something you have to do. Like, it is an opportunity. So if you actually put the work in and you do well on the first one, you don't have to take a second quiz during the week. And I don't somehow I managed to get away with it, but I was pretty blunt and just like, it's not my problem. Like, you're choosing to take 2 quizzes. So for the most part, we didn't get a lot of pushback. There were definitely a couple that complained about it, but like based on other performance aspects in the course, they weren't really prepping for that first one anyway. Right? But I think as long as I explain to them, like, if you are going to have an issue with a second quiz, pretend it's a normal semester and you don't have a retake opportunity and just do well on the first, it's kind of your choice that you're taking too. But there was definitely, they got somewhat snarky in the beginning.
Well, I thank Matt and Megan for leading us through a very interesting SLiTHER with lots of great ideas. And I'm sure this is on a lot of minds out there as we head back towards normalcy in the fall, in theory. So thank you all for attending. Our next SLiTHER is in about 2 weeks on a topic that I forgot to look up ahead of time. So we'll just trust it's going to be great. And it will be. I'm not involved in it.